Loss, a 31-22 deficit to the Washington State Cougars back in week 2. That's the first loss for Luke Fickell and company in the new regime. And we've got a lot to talk about because this is a reality check for a team who said at the beginning that their objective was to win championships here in Madison, a team with high expectations, a team projected to win the Big Ten West, and now a disappointing loss to an unranked team that ends up being now number 23. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to break it all down here on Badgers Talk with your host, Rohan Chakravarthi. But let's start it off. Let's talk about this game before we head on over to the overarching kind of things. Let's talk about the offense because the offense was really somewhat of a tale of two halves. You have the first half, the Badgers down 24-9. They come back. They scored 13 consecutive points, weren't able to convert on a 2-point conversion, end up losing 31-22. But the offense started to wake up in the second half, and even in the first half, when you look at it, right, 3 field goal drives, they got into scoring position 3 times, just were never able to convert from a field or from a touchdown, instead having to resort to field goals for all 3 times. Tanner Mordecai, no, I don't hate this performance at all. I think Tanner Mordecai played fairly well in week 2 and showcased some of the Tanner Mordecai he was at SMU. Was this perfect for Tanner Mordecai? No, not by any means. And there's still a good amount to improve for the quarterback's game, but the 6th-year quarterback showcased aggressiveness. He hit passes on all, 3 levels of the field, and he showcased, ability to also work off schedule, which is important in this offense as well when, that half field read isn't necessarily there. Tanner Mordecai, though, I thought he played well, and I mean, this is considering you had 2 fumbles, a strip sack that ended up being a touchdown as well. There are some plays where you do question his pocket awareness and things like that. But overall, I thought Tanner Mordecai looked downfield, was consistently trying to hit receivers downfield, and even on the incompletions, he was just a half yard off on some of them, just a little. He's got to work on the accuracy a little bit, just a little too far out on some of these throws that could have been major completions downfield. But he had completions to Jamari Dike, completion to Bryson Green, some of these long completions that ended up resulting in chunk plays that allowed the Badgers to get into scoring range and end up putting some points on the board. He also had a phenomenal play, a 16-yard touchdown to Skylar Bell, where he's rolling to his left, and when you make that crossbody throw, people don't realize how difficult that is. A great catch from Bell, but a good ball from Mordecai, making something work off schedule and getting that ball in for a touchdown. And I think that this is the value that you have when you're talking about a 6th-year quarterback, right? After an inconsistent first half for the offense where they could only score 9 points, you talk about the second half. I mean, the offense never gave up in this game. They were able to bring, with aid from the Badgers defense, who played much better in the second half. They were able to come back into this game, and they were able to make an impact. And I think that's definitely important for the 49ers. Or sorry, for the Badgers. Excuse me, mixing up my 2 teams here, but it's very important for the Badgers in that when you can have this symbiotic relationship, what Luke Fickell called complementary football after the game, when you can play complementary football like that, you can see the impact that this Badgers team overall, not only offense or defense, but overall can have. And so offensively, on a day where the run game was absolutely eliminated by the edge rushers and the guys playing the edge for Washington State and Ron Stone Jr. and Brennan Jackson, the passing game is where you kind of had to go, and you also had to operate with a quick game, but also feature some aggressiveness because you're facing a pretty solid pass rush. So you want to get the ball out quick, but you also want to get some chunk plays, spread out the defense a little bit so you have some more opportunity, force them to maybe only rush 4 and give yourself a little more of a chance to potentially make some plays. And the Badgers offense did that on to some accord, Now, they've got to be better. You can't probably win a lot of games only scoring 22 points. They've got to be better, but the opportunities were there. And so that's something I want to highlight. Now, opportunities are opportunities. What it comes down to is execution. And even when I'm talking about a guy like Tanner Mordecai, where, he misses some of these deep throws by just, a half inch or, whatever the margin is, it's still a miss. At the end of the day, when you look at the result, it's an incompletion, not a completion for a chunk play. And so those kind of things you do have to improve. But at least it was an encouraging sign after seeing some inconsistencies with the passing offense in week one. Now, as for the running backs just had no room to run in week two. You'd see, some traction in week one where it was the offense was spreading itself out in the passing game that allowed, pretty favorable matchups on the inside where it's one-on-one blocking and you're able to get past the line of scrimmage because the offensive line is able to maintain some of those key blocks and allow these running backs to get to the second level. That wasn't the case. The Washington State Cougars, they smothered the front, the front five, and really this run game for the Badgers. And it starts off with their edge play. Ron Stone Jr., Brenner Jackson both did a good job, both in the run and the pass. When they're able to contain the edge, you can't have these plays where you bounce out to the outside. You can't have misdirections. You can't have, the kind of make something out of nothing plays and things like that the Badgers were accustomed to in week one at times. You kind of have to go with whatever the game plan is, whatever the game plan calls for. And if it's runs up the middle, well, you've got other players up there in the secondary and in that second level of the defense with the linebackers that are able to make plays. Washington State's got a good linebacker. And I mean, a guy who was flying all across the field, a guy who I tried to warn you guys about coming into the game was safety Jaden Hicks. Jaden Hicks had a great game. When you look at his trigger and the way that he's able to just jump into the line of scrimmage from the safety position, Jaden Hicks had a great game for Washington State, eliminating some of these runs. But the other issue was not only did the offensive line, have some struggles early on, the defense also, when you give up 24 points, it's hard for you to maintain, a balanced game plan, run the ball a lot while not understanding the urgency that comes with trying to get back into this game. The Badgers had to rely on their passing attack because they were down 24-9 at some point in this game. They were trailing for a majority, if not the entirety of this game. And so when you talk about the run game, that's where, the main struggles occurred. It's one, the offensive line couldn't block as well. Especially on that edge play, which is what Luke Fickell kind of alluded to earlier today when we spoke to him. And then two, the defense, giving up as many points as they gave up, that forced a change in it, an alteration in game plan to airing the ball out a lot more than you might have expected to start it off. Now, that doesn't mean that the Badgers didn't feature their running backs. Braylon Allen still had a good amount of catches. Funny enough, he now leads the Big Ten with 13 catches in the two games. And I asked Luke Fickell about that earlier today. Is that going to be a good portion of what your passing game is going to be? And he said that's an area they're going to want to improve on. And a different element for running backs is getting the ball out in space. And what better way to do it than catching a pass in the flat, looking ahead of you, and trying to make a play out of it. And the Badgers trust both of their running backs. Even after the fumble from Chez Mellusi earlier this week, they trust both of their running backs. They want both of their running backs to make plays in space. And that includes, a lot for Braylon Allen, where you're putting him out in space. He's a bigger guy. You're trying to get him different opportunities, different ways to get the ball, showcase the other portions of his talents as well. So Allen now with 13 catches, that's an interesting sign for the Badgers. Do I like the amount of volume that he's getting? I'm not going to say I'm the biggest fan of it, just because I think some of the plays that they run to Allen are predictable, and also puts a significant onus on some of your wide receivers, whereas, the defense is charging forward at you. It only results in a few short yard plays. But maybe in a tempo offense where you're trying to just get a few yards of play and continue to turn the sticks, I think that's something that they could definitely continue to work on. And I think especially when you kind of get a little more gelling with everybody in terms of the timing for the passes as well as the blocking downfield, I think you can this could be something that the Badgers continue to utilize, maybe to a lesser degree, but something that they continue to utilize. And head coach Luke Fickell alluded to, this is something we were going to want to work on and something we're going to want to focus on. And so, there's another portion of the game that the Badgers could add to their offensive approach going forward. One thing I do want to say, I like that Braylon Allen's getting a lot of volume. I mean, he's a talented player. You definitely want to get him as much volume as possible. I do want to see Chez Mellusi, though, out there in the receiving game. I think his build might be a little better for when you get him out in space, that he can accelerate. He could potentially get you some of those, grind yards a little better. But we'll see. The Badgers like to feature Allen because not only because of what he provides in the run game, but now as a dual threat, a dual threat commodity, it's tough for defenses to guard that. It's not like they can stack the box. It provides them a couple of different avenues now that they can bring in the ball, but also show defenses different offensive looks that they're going to have to be wary about, not only the run, but also the pass to the running backs. Let's talk about the wide receivers. Wide receivers had a good game. I mean, when you look at it, there wasn't any major drops. Will Pauling continues to be featured. Chamari DK had some huge catches. With Bryson Green as well. Bryson Green he caught a deep ball. And so when you look at the overall way that the passing game kind of went in week 2, I like the continue to spread out the ball. You want to make sure that all of your targets are getting the ball, and I thought that the Badgers did a good job of that in week 2. I mean, when you look at the overall kind of portion of it, Wisconsin, you're trying to feature as many weapons as possible. And I know the tight end position, you don't necessarily see as much volume towards the tight end position thus far. The Badgers aren't as strong at that position. You got true tight end or true freshman Tucker Ashcraft really serving as your main guy. But on the day, I mean, you look at it, Will Pauling, 5 catches, 78 yards. I said before the season, I feel he's going to be the guy that paces the Badgers in receiving yards and receiving catches this year out of the receivers. Chamari DK, though, I mean, he had a 75 yards, 4 catches. He also had a 41-yard catch early in the game. Bryson Green, no slouch. He had 2 catches for 54 yards. Skylar Bell, 5 catches, 44 yards. Braylon Allen, 6 catches, 12 yards. CJ Williams even got in the mix. I mean, that's a lot of receivers. You talk about, spreading the ball out. The Badgers got their top 6 guys in the fold, all of them. I mean, sorry, their top 5 guys in the fold, all of them. I mean, Skylar Bell's going to get in there, get some slot work in, maybe even some 4 receiver set work in. But CJ Williams was the guy, you wanted to start getting going, and as well as the top 3. I mean, it's cool to see Tanner Mordecai not only, he's getting comfortable with a lot of these guys. And for a team with a lot of transfers, for a team with, some gelling that's required in this potential group with the quarterback, it's good to see that the Badgers are kind of getting on board. Green kind of getting himself in the mix. Pauling obviously continuing to do what he does, and then Chamari DK being as reliable as he is. So, the Badgers, that's a good sign for them. But receivers, I think that this is going to be a strong suit for this team, receivers and running backs. I think that both groups are going to be a strong group, hold for this team. And why this performance is promising for both of these positions? Well, last week, what happened? The passing game didn't work as well. So what do? They relied on the running game. This week, the running game didn't work as well. Washington State had them figured out. They had them out game planned. So the Badgers focus on the passing game. And the good thing is having as many receivers as you do allows you to potentially, not necessarily be one-sided, but if the game calls for it, you can rely on your passing game. Whereas in the past, the Badgers might not have had as great pass catchers and, as good of a quarterback. So you can kind of focus, you want as balanced of attack as possible, but when one side's not working, you can rely on the other side a little more. But this offense still has a little bit to go. I do think that, when you talk about 22 points, when you talk about the way this offense goes, you're a huge thing Luke Fickell continues to talk about is finishing. You got to be able to finish some of these drives. The Badgers can't continue to just pile on field goals. I mean, their first drive, it got killed or their first scoring drive, they started off well. DK got them a good start. They started their own 40. And, you got all the way to the Washington State 25. A sack puts you out of or forces you into a field goal. Vakos kicks that. The next one, I mean, you're close. You get to the 16-yard line, can't finish that drive. Another Vakos field goal. Then the third field goal, which came at the end of the half, you get to the Washington State 11, and you still can't finish the drive. It's things like these that the Badgers kind of have to focus on cleaning it up, making sure that you're able to finish these drives, not succumbing to these penalties, making sure fumbles, those kind of things don't occur either. But there's a good amount to work on for the offense. But I thought that, there were still some promising features as well. But the one group that I think will have the lowest grade of them all offensively, the offensive line. I thought, when it comes to Wisconsin football and also Luke Fickell's mentality, winning in the trenches is what's going to help you win games. The Badgers did not win in the trenches on week 2. Jack Nelson, obviously, had probably one of his roughest games as a Badger. Going up against Ron Stone, gave up two strip sacks that ended up being both of Mordecai's fumbles. I believe Ron Stone finished the game with 2 sacks. Kyle Thornton had the third sack. But the Badgers were dominated both in the run and the pass on the at the edge. I mean, Riley Mallman, Jack Nelson, not the strongest game for them. Brennan Jackson and Ron Stone Jr. Both of them had they had a good job. They did a good job containing and doing well in the pass rush. This was a good performance from Washington State on the with their defensive line versus the Badgers' offensive line, and that's why the run game didn't work as well. That's why 2 of the turnovers were created that ended up essentially being the main dictator. With Mordecai's 2 fumbles, one was returned for a touchdown and things like that. So when you look back at it, it's trench play that kind of leads to some of these turnovers, and the Badgers obviously struggled with that trench play overall. But if we move over to the defense is where I kind of got a lot of thoughts here. Starting off, we'll start off with the front guys. Thought the front guys weren't as great in this game, especially early. The Badgers thought that they could rush 3, and it's not that that was a bad game plan. The point of rushing 3 is that you have another guy out there that can help contain the quarterback as a linebacker. You drop 8 into coverage, you're kind of forcing Cameron Ward to make decisions. But Cameron Ward had plenty of time. He was able to figure out different ways to throw the ball or different ways to run the ball. He was very, very comfortable in the first half. And the number one thing the Badgers couldn't do is let Cameron Ward be comfortable, especially early, and allowing him to develop the rhythm that he ended up developing in that first half where they scored 24 points. Ward was the X factor in this game for the Badgers. He was the guy who you really had to stop. And I believe my matchup to watch this week was Cameron Ward versus the Badgers defense, because he was the true guy who could extend the drives for Washington State, could be a threat both with his legs and in the air. There's so much that you have to account for when it comes to Cameron Ward, who's a much improved he's a much improved passer as well. And so, the way that the Badgers started, it was pass rusher wasn't there. They were trying to rush 3. Unfortunately, the Badgers don't really have the edge guys and the defensive line overall to be able to rush 3 and successfully get to the quarterback that much. That means you're putting an onus on your secondary and on your linebackers, and you're putting an onus on sound tackling whenever the play gets made. And so it's tough to hold up for that long in coverage and be able to create plays. It was a fine first drive, but then Washington State starts up. They end up getting their first touchdown drive early on, and that ends up being the starting for Washington State. They score a touchdown. Badgers couldn't respond. They only get a field goal. Then Washington State scores a touchdown. What did Badgers do? A field goal. Then Washington State scores. They were just consistently ahead of the Badgers in this game, and it was a plethora of big plays, but also figuring out different ways to move the chains for Washington State. Defensive line, not that promising in the first half. I thought second half, James Thompson, he had a couple of nice plays, including the safety. Ended up with 1.5 sacks. The Badgers continued to dial up pressure in different ways. Moomin and Jong Meta, Jake Chaney got sacks. CJ Getz, I believe, was the other one who shared a sack with James Thompson. Ended up with 4 sacks on the day, but you might have wanted some of this pressure from the linebackers. These linebacker blitzes that Tressel showed eloquently in the second half of week 1, start that earlier. The Badgers weren't prepared early enough. They tried to be a little more vanilla early enough, tried to kind of be basic. Rush 3, drop back 8, and see if you could stop Cameron Ward. That didn't happen. And on top of that, when you look at the beginning of the game, the Badgers were clearly outmatched by Washington State's tempo. It was interesting because when I spoke to Moomin Jong Meta earlier this week, he said that he felt tempo offenses were overrated. And Luke Fickle didn't say that necessarily, but he said that the team would be prepared for it. And when you look at the way that the defense aligned, there were several miscommunications and also several penalties because they weren't lined up in time. And those miscommunications led to a lot of those big plays. It's not only the one-on-one coverages that the Badgers got burned and then that led to big plays. It was a lot of miscommunications that led to some of these big plays where it was a great design from Benjamin Arbuckle, and just the way that the tempo worked, the Badgers just felt that they were taken off guard. And so that can't be happening. You can't allow for your defense to consistently make these mistakes. And it was a much better performance in the second half. Don't get me wrong, but it's too little too late. The Badgers cannot start as slowly as they have now in the first two games defensively and expect to consistently win games. It was only 10 points in the first game, but you could sense they were starting slow before shutting them out, or closely shutting them out in the second half. They scored 7 points off a turnover, and then in this game, it's only 7 points after at the end, after shutting them out for a good portion of the second half. But you gave up 24 points in the first half. That kind of thing, and again, it's 17 points. One of them was a fumble return touchdown, but it's like that kind of thing where you do want the defense to have a little more consistency throughout the game. And it's not only on the players, which they do have to execute better, but they have to prepare a little better as well. And they weren't prepared for the up-tempo offense of Washington State this week. That was something that it seemed pretty clear with the way that substitutions weren't working, with the way the amount of miscommunications they had, things like that. You got to improve going forward. And unfortunately, I mean, again, this is a part of the gelling process. Mike Tressel's the new coordinator, some new players in a new scheme, things like that. You're still working through the kinks, but you would have hoped that there was some increased level of consistency than what we saw in week 2. Linebackers wise, I mean, I thought it was all right. There were a couple of poor Jake Chaney plays early on. I think I charted like 2 or 3 where it was either a missed tackle or a bad angle that I felt occurred. But Chaney, Muma both had a sack. Jordan Turner obviously out the first half of the game. So there are a couple of things, but I mean, when you talk about the Badgers overall, those were the main takeaways I had defensively. Something I do want to point out, though, defensive backs, Kamoy Latu was pulled. He was benched in this game, and Luke Fickell spoke about it earlier today, said Kamoy Latu took it well, still want to make sure that he's a portion of the game plan. They believe he's too talented to stay on the sidelines, but he was pulled, didn't have the best week 1. And that over-aggressiveness and the way that Kamoy Latu plays in a way a little emotionally, that might cost the Badgers, and they decided to place Preston Zachman, a guy who hadn't really played in the Kamoy Latu role at all during practice, according to Fickell. They placed him in, and then they felt he did a pretty solid job. So that's a storyline to monitor going forward. But the Badgers right now, defensively, a couple of things to work on for sure. Intrigued to see if there's a little more Nizer Forquaron this week. I didn't see him as much early in the game. And so intrigued to see if they have a little more of him earlier this week. I'd assume, though, with a little slower tempo now, you might be able to make better substitutions. You might be able to be a little more on pace. But this is a humbling loss for the Badgers. That's the word that they use to describe it. This is a humbling loss. And so, I mean, this is something that Wisconsin's really got to look forward, evaluate, and look and see, can they achieve what their aspirations were this season? Because they had some pretty high aspirations, and now, you're going to have to find a much better way to win than the team you saw in week 2. That's the only way the Badgers can truly reevaluate themselves, come across, and have a truly overly successful season where they can make a Big Ten championship. I do want to talk about coaching, though, because coming into the season, I thought coaching was going to be one of the biggest positives for the Badgers. I mean, you got a very experienced head coach in Luke Fickell. You've got a coordinator in Mike Tressel, who was named I forget what it was. Like he was given an award in 2022 for being one of the best coordinators in his conference. I mean, he's a guy who's well established as well. Been at Michigan State, was at Cincinnati. He's well established, and his scheme can work. It's aggressive, but it can work. You've got good coaching staff, a good coaching staff all across the board. I thought, though, the Badgers were outcoached by a more inexperienced staff in week 2. You got Jake Dickert over there of Washington State. It's his second year as a head coach. Benjamin Arbuckle, a fairly new coordinator as well. But I thought both of them, did a phenomenal job for Washington State in week 2, whereas the Badgers seemed outcoached. I talked about the miscommunications and things like that. That's a coaching thing. And Luke Fickell took accountability for it. He said that we got to prepare our guys better for those tempo situations and things like that. But that should have happened. And I felt like with already facing a tempo offense, it seemed like, some of these clicks could have happened earlier this offseason, and especially this week when you're talking about the tempo, because that was the true thing Washington State had to its favor. Because once you're playing tempo, that really accelerates how Cam Ward can play, because it kind of allows him to operate on his own and make plays in different ways. And unfortunately, the Badgers were not prepared for that. But also mentally, it seemed like at the beginning of the game, they were just defeated. You love the resilience. because like I said, a tale of two halves earlier for some of the offensive pieces, some of the defensive pieces. That was the same for coaching. I mean, the way that they were able to will this team to come back and fight in the second half, unfortunately couldn't finish. It's definitely something to point out, but it's intriguing that an experienced coaching staff got out coached in week two, by a more inexperienced coaching staff. One's in their second year. That's Do I expect that for the entirety of the year? No. I have full faith in Luke Fickell. I think Luke Fickell's a phenomenal head coach. And I think that, when you look at the hiring, when it's all said and done, it's going to be a very good hire for Wisconsin. But that was another portion of maybe, underestimating your opponent a little bit, which I didn't expect from the Fickell era this early. Let's talk about some improvements, though. The Badgers can make some improvements. If you're talking about this, like this team overall, talked about offensively. I think offensively, some improvements you can make that I kind of hope to see in game. If your tackles are having a bit of a tough time, you got different ways to chip them. You can use running backs, you can use tight ends. The Badgers utilize two tight end sets a couple of times. You can use tight ends, you can chip a little bit, especially when the tight end in this offense isn't as valuable, at least at the moment, given the way the Badgers have utilized their tight ends. That could be a way where you could help out your tackles against those tougher D end opponents or outside linebacker opponents. Chip them. That's a potential solution there that I thought could have occurred. But overall, improvements wise, offensively, if the run isn't working, good way. You might want to set up the pass earlier than the run, but more so, I think the biggest improvement kind of has to be discipline. When you talk about the penalties and things like that, the little mental mistakes that set the Badgers back, you're hoping that those kind of erase themselves as the season goes on. The Badgers had 4 penalties, I believe, for 30 yards in this game, but the biggest mental issue, not mental issue, the biggest discipline issue was the turnovers, right? Tanner Mordecai fumbles twice on strip sacks. Ches Malusi fumbles on a controversial call and things like that. And the reason that it's more of a negative show and not a positive show is because despite all of these, the Badgers still had a very good shot to win this game. Unfortunately, with the ball at the 50-yard line, down 2 points late in the game, they were not able to convert. They had a very good shot of winning this game. And I don't want to sound overly negative. We're going to get to, the outlook of the season going forward in a bit, but that's kind of why you want to see where do the Badgers go to where they don't have to be in this situation again. I mean, this is it was a very solid Washington State team. Don't get me wrong, but you do want to put yourselves in a situation where you can consistently be competitive, but also consistently have the advantage against your opponents when applicable. And so, improvements wise, I think offensively, you do want to continue to see the offense enact a similar game plan as to what it was last week. Have a good balance of the run of the pass. That needs to be established, and that'll be established in closer games. Have a good balance of the run of the pass, but you want to see Tanner Mordecai continue to be aggressive. He's going to try, I think given his accuracy numbers in the past, you're going to see him improve a little bit on the downfield passing, get some of those timing things, get some of those accuracy issues under control as he continues to gel with his receivers, figure out the way that they run routes, their release package, their speed, things like that. Once you can get more accustomed to it, I think that you've got an option and you can kind of be a little better in that regard. So that's something that I'm looking for offensively. Defensively, though, it's kind of being on the same page and playing cleaner football. You're trying to figure out ways where you minimize the amount of missed tackles and minimize those kind of mental issues that the Badgers have seen and has costed them on certain drives. Because the more you can get these 3 and outs, the quicker you can run your up-tempo offense, the quicker you can place the pressure on your opposing team. But also, overall, it provides you more confidence. It can help you with the flow of the game. And so defensively, I think the Badgers, first of all, it's starting strong because that hasn't necessarily been the case in the first 2 games. Definitely you want to start strong, but it starts, with the mindset kind of thing, seeing how they can improve in week 3. I'm looking forward to it because it's an opponent where you're expected to win. The Badgers are favored by about 19 points to begin the week against Georgia Southern, but this is an opponent where you're trying to get everything back on track. And that's why even against an opponent where you're expected to win, I want to see pristine execution. Heading into conference play, you want to see the execution be at its finest. You want to see, both sides of the football being mentally prepared and things like that. And that's what I'm curious to see in week 3. Now let's talk about the season. Is the Badger season over? They're 1-1. They just lost to a non-top 25 team. It wasn't a pretty loss. It was not a pretty loss. They tried to come back, couldn't finish the game, things like that. But is their season over? No. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's time to jump to overreactions. No fire Fickle, no fire Tressel. I don't think it's time to jump to overreactions at all. If you look at the outlook of this team, this Washington State team is a good team. I mean, right now they're a top 25 team. You lost to a top 25 team. Now, the way you lost isn't the most prettiest, right? But the resilience of this team shows that they can fight back, to show that, they can count on their quarterback when they need it. Some of the questions that you wanted answered prior to the week were answered, just not under the circumstances that you might have hoped for, like what Mordecai can do, like how this team can fight back under adversity and things like that. Those are things that Luke Fickell preaches, and I thought that those kind of things did a solid. They did a solid job with. I think the clearest number one important game now on the schedule is against Iowa. I think the winner of that likely has the upper shot, the upper echelon on the other guy to make the Big Ten championship, because Iowa's 2-0. And that you obviously only face them once this season. The head-to-head matchup is going to be very, very crucial. And so that's the game that is going to now be the most important in salvaging the Badgers season and, getting to where they want to be, standings wise, record wise, and potentially in the Big Ten championship against one of those elite Big Ten East teams. And so there's a lot to definitely, talk about in this one, but I don't think that the season is over. Not at all. I think the Badgers still have a fairly solid team that needs to definitely work out some of their wrinkles. Definitely got a lot to work on here, but it's a good reset week, a good time to kind of get your feet back together before conference play. And I'm not trying to overlook Georgia Southern either, but this is an important week for the Badgers to kind of hone in, start executing better, start figuring out, what kind of works for them game plan wise heading into conference play, because those conference games is where you truly do not want to lose one step. You want to make sure you come out strong. You want to make sure you hold the competitive advantage against your opponents and things like that. But disappointing loss in week 2. Definitely a lot of accountability to be had around the board, starting with the coaches, the players, different, even, I mean, if you want to say the referees, you can. I don't tend to try and blame the referees for any loss, things like that. But, you can see it as you wish. But I think that there's a lot of accountability, to be had on the board. And I think the Badgers have some refinement for sure in all 3 categories: special teams, offense, and defense, that they've got to work on, as well as their coaching. A lot of refinement that can be had, but would caution you guys not to hit the brakes on the season thus far. It's still going to be, I think this Badgers football team is still going to be a pretty exciting team in week 3. And this is going to be a team that you got to look forward to going forward. Is this the final time that they're in the top 25? I don't think so. I think you still got, some momentum where they can climb back in. They can fight against some of these opponents. And when you look at their schedule, it's not that tough of a schedule this year. It's not that tough of a schedule. The one team that is ranked, or I guess the 2 now that Iowa's ranked, the 2 teams that are ranked that they face are Ohio State in week 4. And then as well as, sorry, not week 4, Ohio State, I forget exactly the week is, but on Halloween weekend, it's Ohio State. And then you also face Iowa, who's at the 25 right on the border. But that's going to do it for me. Talked a lot about the offense, the defense, improvements, things we want to see, and the season outlook going forward. Make sure you guys hit a subscribe on this video. Make sure you guys check out all the latest at Bucky's Fifth Quarter, because we're putting out a lot of fun content. We got some new writers coming in soon as well. So I appreciate all you guys for your support. We'll be back with another video soon.